The guns spoke before Europe knew his name, and their thunder announced not only the rise of a man, but the arrival of a new age of war. In fields still ruled by the slow rhythm of old dynasties, amid the rigid lines and powdered wigs of 18th century generals, an obscure Corsican officer began to bend the battlefield to his will. He did not inherit a crown, he did not command by birthright, he seized power with the cold precision of a mathematician and the burning drive of a revolutionary. His instrument was not ceremony, but force. Not ceremony, but fire. Not inherited privilege, but a mind that could see patterns of movement in the chaos of battle where others saw only smoke and blood. Napoleon Bonaparte came into a world in which warfare was ritualized and limited, still governed by the habits of an earlier century. Armies moved like heavy machines, lumbering from fortress to fortress, campaigns dictated by supply depots and the seasons. Battles were often formal confrontations in open fields, with infantry assembled in rigid lines, cavalry poised for controlled charges, and artillery relegated to the background as a supporting tool. The generals of the old monarchies behaved as custodians of tradition more than creators of new methods. War, though brutal, followed a familiar script. Into this script stepped a young man from Corsica, a rocky island on the margins of the French kingdom. He grew up surrounded by memories of resistance, in a land that had struggled for its independence before falling under French control. From an early age, he absorbed the language of struggle, ambition, and identity. Sent to the mainland to study in military schools, he discovered something else: the power of reason, mathematics, and calculation. Artillery was considered a branch for officers who prized intellect over pedigree. It attracted him immediately. Where others saw cumbersome guns dragged by horses, he saw geometry, trajectories, force, and timing turning metal and powder into decision. While many noble officers treated their positions as extensions of social standing, Napoleon treated his as a craft. He studied the endurance of horses, the time it took to move batteries across mud, the effect of weather on gunpowder, the angles at which shot would ricochet. He learned to coordinate the fire of multiple batteries so that their impact would converge in shattering bursts on a chosen point. To him, artillery was a language of numbers translated into terror on the field. The French Revolution tore open the old order and exposed France to internal chaos and external attack. Thrones trembled, borders blazed. Many careers ended in the shadow of the guillotine. Yet this time of danger was also a time of opportunity for those with talent and nerve. The revolution swept aside many of the aristocrats who had traditionally dominated the army, making space for officers who rose through ability rather than blood. In this storm, Napoleon found his moment. At Toulon, a vital Mediterranean port seized by royalists and held with British support, France faced a dangerous crisis. Whoever commanded the harbor commanded a gateway to the south. The young artillery officer who arrived there saw not only a siege, but a puzzle. The enemy held powerful positions. Ships in the harbor threatened French movements. Many would have settled into a slow, grinding attempt to starve the city. Napoleon saw that if he could place his guns on specific heights commanding the harbor, he could make the position untenable in a sudden, brutal stroke. He reorganized the artillery with relentless energy. Guns were dragged across rough terrain, placed in newly prepared batteries, and aligned to create overlapping fields of fire. Rather than disperse them evenly, he concentrated them where they could strike hardest. When the bombardment began, it did not merely harass the enemy, it tore at the very roots of their defense. Key fortifications crumbled. The British fleet, battered and exposed, could no longer safely hold its position. In a short span of time, the siege that had threatened to become a costly stalemate tilted decisively. Toulon fell. From the smoke and shattered stone, a reputation was born. This early triumph embodied much of what would define Napoleon's military genius. He saw artillery not as an accessory, but as a hammer. He believed in concentration of force rather than timid dispersion. He understood that a single decisive point, struck with overwhelming power, could decide the outcome of a whole campaign. And he was willing to take risks to place his guns where they could exert that decisive influence, even if it meant pushing them forward under fire or dragging them where others thought it impossible. From Toulon, he rose with astonishing speed. France, beset by enemies on all sides, needed commanders who could deliver victories. In Italy, a French army faced the combined forces of Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia. The theater was difficult. Narrow valleys, broken terrain, rivers and mountains carved the land into compartments. The French troops were badly supplied and demoralized, more accustomed to retreat than advance. To many in Paris, the Italian front looked like a dead end, but for Napoleon, newly appointed to command, it was an open door. He arrived small in stature, thin and intense, with piercing eyes and a sharp tongue. Some laughed at his physical appearance, expecting little from this unassuming figure. The soldiers, hungry and poorly clothed, eyed him with skepticism. He answered that skepticism not with promises alone, but with a vision of movement and victory. He told them that they would march, that they would live off the wealth of the rich plains of Italy, that they would strike blows that would echo through France and Europe. Then he set out to make those words real through a campaign that would redefine operational art. In Italy, Napoleon applied with relentless clarity the idea of central position. His enemies were divided into separate forces, spread across different lines of communication. Instead of confronting them together, he inserted his army between them. From that central location, he moved quickly to overwhelm one opponent before the others could intervene. The terrain that had seemed an obstacle to others became, in his hands, a set of walls that separated his enemies from each other while shielding his own movements from their view. At Montenat, Millesimo, and Dago, he executed a series of blows that demonstrated this principle. He concentrated superior force at each point of contact, winning battles in rapid succession. His troops, invigorated by success and the promise of plunder, moved faster than their opponents believed possible. Austrian and Sardinian commanders found that what they thought were secure flanks suddenly became exposed to converging French attacks. Napoleon's army seemed always to appear where it could do the greatest harm and vanish before a counterstroke could land. The Battle of Lodi provided a dramatic example of his willingness to fuse audacity with calculation. The Austrian rearguard held a bridge over the Adda River, and they believed the French would not dare to assault such a narrow, well-defended passage. The bridge was swept by artillery, the approaches covered by musket fire. To force the crossing looked like madness. Napoleon, however, understood the psychological effect such an assault could have on his own army and his enemies alike. He gathered his troops, organized an attack, and hurled them forward in a storm of fire. The crossing was a slaughterous affair, but the French made it across, driving the enemy back. The image of their general leading them near the front underline's flying shot became legend. In that moment, the army ceased to see him as just a commander. He became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. At Arcole and Rivoli, he showed a different side of his strategic mind. These battles were not simple frontal assaults. They were intricate dances with terrain and timing. At Arcole, the marshy ground and narrow causeways turned the battlefield into a maze. Napoleon used feints, sudden shifts of direction, and constant pressure to unbalance the Austrians, pushing them to exhaustion and panic. At Rivoli, confronted by multiple columns of enemy forces advancing through mountainous terrain, he read the ground as if it were a map etched in his own hand. He identified the key heights and passes, deployed his troops to hold or seize them, and used his artillery to dominate the valleys where the Austrians attempted to deploy. What could have been a chaotic clash became, in his hands, a carefully orchestrated destruction of an enemy army. These victories were not accidental. They arose from a deeper approach to war. Napoleon believed that speed was a weapon equal to firepower. He drove his soldiers on forced marches, urging them to cover distances in days that other commanders expected to require weeks. He did not move his army as one rigid mass, but split it into divisions that could advance on multiple roads, converging at decisive moments. This dispersal confused his enemies, who struggled to guess his true objective. When the time came, however, he pulled his forces together like tightening muscles, delivering crushing blows against isolated enemy corps. At the heart of this system was his emerging concept of operational maneuver. He looked beyond the immediate front line to the wider theater, asking how each movement could position his army for future advantage. He thought not only in terms of individual battles, but of sequences of actions that would unravel the enemy's plans over the course of an entire campaign. It was this operational mind that distinguished him from many contemporaries who saw warfare more as a series of discrete engagements than an interlocking chain of moves and countermoves. Victory in Italy transformed his status. No longer a mere upstart, he became the brightest star in the military firmament of revolutionary France. Yet he did not rely on battlefield success alone to consolidate his position. He understood the power of narrative, of myth, of carefully crafted image. His bulletins to the army and to the French public turned his campaigns into epic stories. He praised his soldiers as heroes, linked their sacrifices to the glory of the nation, and portrayed himself as the faithful servant and guiding genius of their efforts. These bulletins did something more as well. They were instruments of psychological warfare. Napoleon's enemies did not read only his troop movements. They read his reputation, the stories of his daring, his sudden appearances where defeat seemed certain, his unbroken string of victories, all combined to create a sense of dread among those who faced him. Some generals entered battle already half-beaten in their minds, convinced that he would outmaneuver them. Some armies, encountering French troops advancing with the confidence of habitual winners, faltered more quickly than their numbers alone would predict. Morale and imagination became part of his arsenal. It was not only foreign enemies whose minds he sought to influence. Within France, he cultivated the image of a leader who could restore order after the wild storms of the revolution. His expedition to Egypt was not merely a military operation. It was a grand projection of power, culture, and ambition. He wished to threaten British interests by reaching toward the route to India, but he also wished to dress his conquest in the robes of enlightenment. He brought scholars, scientists, engineers, and artists alongside his soldiers. While his troops fought the Mamluks in battles where French squares, anchored by artillery, cut down waves of cavalry, his savants cataloged ancient monuments, studied the Nile, and produced works that dazzled European audiences. On the battlefield of the pyramids, he demonstrated once more the fusion of firepower and discipline. The Mamluk horsemen were brave and skilled, but they charged against walls of bayonets and cannon fire arranged in tight formations that turned their courage into ruin. Napoleon used his artillery and infantry in mutually supporting patterns, each reinforcing the other, each covering the weaknesses of the other. No longer did cavalry alone decide battles. The interplay of arms under a single guiding mind became decisive. Egypt, however, also revealed the limits of even a brilliant commander when confronted with extended lines of communication and naval inferiority. The destruction of the French fleet left his army isolated. Strategic success on land could not compensate for defeat at sea. Eventually, he left his troops to their fate and returned to France, where he seized power in a political coup, becoming first consul and later emperor. The lesson was stark. War had expanded beyond fields and fortresses into a truly global contest of resources and mobility. As the ruler of France, Napoleon reshaped the state so that it could sustain his way of war. He systematized conscription, drawing on the manpower of the nation with unprecedented scale. He built a more efficient bureaucracy to collect taxes, supply armies, and maintain public order. He pushed through reforms in education, administration, and law, culminating in a civil code that organized society around principles of property rights and legal equality. These internal changes were not simply acts of domestic governance, but the foundation stones of his military machine. Armies need food, roads, uniforms, and weapons as much as inspiration. And Napoleon understood that the state had to become a disciplined instrument, just as his army was. From this reformed France, he launched the campaigns that would make his name synonymous with mastery. In 1805, faced with a new coalition of powers determined to crush the revolutionary state-turned-empire, he moved with stunning speed. While the British controlled the sea, he struck at their continental allies. Marching his grand army from the Channel coast deep into Central Europe, he maneuvered with an elegance and coherence that left contemporary observers astonished. The Ulm campaign stands as one of the purest expressions of his talent for encirclement and operational deception. The Austrian general Mack believed he faced a French army advancing from one direction. In reality, Napoleon's corps swept across broad fronts, crossing rivers at unexpected points, using secondary roads, and masking their true routes with screening forces. Before the Austrians fully grasped what was happening, they found themselves surrounded in the fortress town of Ulm, their lines of retreat cut. Without a large, decisive pitched battle, an entire army was forced to surrender. Here, Napoleon demonstrated that maneuver could achieve results that massed bayonets alone could not. Encirclement, executed with precision and speed, became a hallmark of his style. Yet he was not content with operational victories. He sought decisive battles that would dictate political outcomes. At Austerlitz later that same year, he created what many have called his masterpiece. The battlefield was not chosen at random. He studied the terrain, identified the heights, the low ground, the ponds, and the approach routes. He positioned his forces in a way that invited misinterpretation. To enemy eyes, his right flank appeared dangerously exposed. His center seemed weaker than expected. Rumors spread that his army was overextended and tired, that he was looking for a way to retreat. The Allied commanders, convinced of their numerical superiority, decided to exploit this apparent weakness. They stripped their center of strength in order to swing around and crush what they believed to be a vulnerable French wing. Napoleon had anticipated this. He had deliberately lured them into that plan. As the Allied forces moved forward, stretching their lines and abandoning their strong central position, he held his reserve in readiness. When the moment came, he launched a massive attack through the suddenly weakened enemy center, seizing the Pratzen heights that dominated the field. Once again, artillery played a decisive role, blasting the shattered enemy formations as they attempted to regroup. The ponds that dotted the field became death traps as retreating troops tried to escape across thin ice under French fire. The victory at Austerlitz was not simply a matter of musketry and bayonets. It was an act of deception, timing, and orchestration. Napoleon had shaped not only his own deployment, but also the enemy decision-making. He had made them think what he wanted them to think, move where he wanted them to move, and expose themselves at the moment he chose. It was the convergence of psychological warfare, mastery of terrain, and precise control of reserves. In the following years, he dismantled the military power of Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt, where his corps system showed its full strength. The Prussian army, once famed for iron discipline, had ossified into a rigid institution out of step with the new realities of war. Its commanders moved slowly, clung to outdated procedures, and underestimated their opponent. Napoleon's corps maneuvered with autonomy yet under a unified vision, converging on critical points, striking at isolated Prussian forces before they could coordinate. Once more, the emphasis on rapid movement, concentration of force, and aggressive use of artillery turned the scale. The Winter Battle of Eylau and the summer victory at Friedland against Russia showed another side of Napoleonic warfare: the willingness to endure horrific attrition when he believed the strategic stakes justified it, and the ability to rally his men in the face of fearsome resistance. At Eylau, fighting in snow and storm, his army suffered grievous casualties, yet did not break. At Friedland, he returned to form, using the geography of the river to trap and smash a large Russian force. The Russia of the Tsar would temporarily come to terms with France, acknowledging the reality of Napoleonic dominance over the continent. Throughout these campaigns, his system of corps allowed unmatched flexibility. Each corps contained infantry supported by cavalry and artillery, able to operate independently but designed to support the others. On the march, they spread out, living off the land when necessary, making it difficult for enemies to discover the true concentration of forces. In battle, they tightened into a coherent whole, assaulting, defending, and reserving according to Napoleon's plan. This modular approach prefigured modern operational structures and became a template copied by many armies in the decades to come. Yet for all his brilliance, the seeds of future failure lay hidden in the very scope of his ambition. The Peninsular War in Spain erupted when he attempted to reshape the Iberian Peninsula by placing his brother on the Spanish throne. What he expected to be a quick political adjustment turned into a grinding struggle. French armies initially won conventional battles using the same combination of movement and firepower that had brought them success elsewhere. But in Spain, they faced a different kind of war. Local populations rose against the invaders, attacking supply lines, ambushing small detachments, and fading into the hills and villages. This kind of war, later known as guerrilla warfare, imposed constant strain. Napoleon's system, designed for decisive battles against organized armies, struggled against an enemy that refused to present itself in the form he preferred. British forces under Wellington learned to combine conventional engagement with use of local resistance, slowly bleeding French strength. Here, Napoleon's ability to divide and conquer formally organized coalitions was less effective. The enemy was not a single central army, but a multitude of small, elusive groups linked only by their determination to resist. In 1809, as Austria rose once more against him, he faced another stern test on the Danube. At Aspern-Essling, he attempted to cross the river near Vienna, using bridges that proved vulnerable to the river's currents and the enemy's attacks. For the first time in a major battle on such a scale, he suffered a clear tactical defeat. Yet even here, his control and discipline allowed an orderly withdrawal rather than a total catastrophe. He learned quickly, adjusted his approach, and at Wagram later that year delivered one of his most massive victories. On that vast, flat battlefield, he formed immense concentrations of artillery, a great battery whose guns roared in unison, scouring large swaths of ground, paving the way for infantry assaults. The scale of firepower demonstrated at Wagram hinted at the industrialized carnage that later centuries would see. By now, Napoleon stood at the summit of power, emperor of a vast empire stretching across much of Europe. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous every misstep became. Confident in his system, trusting in his ability to bend events to his will, he made the fateful decision to invade Russia in 1812. The campaign began with familiar elements: rapid advances, attempts to force the Russian army into a decisive battle, the use of multiple columns moving across wide spaces. Yet the distances were immense, the roads poor, and the Russian strategy fundamentally different. The Russians, under pressure, retreated steadily, trading space for time. They burned supplies, abandoned cities, and refused to give Napoleon the kind of concentrated, decisive engagement he sought until they had drawn him deep into their territory. At Smolensk and then at Borodino, they did finally stand and fight, and the clash at Borodino became one of the bloodiest single days of battle in European history. Napoleon hurled his men against fortified positions, using artillery and repeated infantry assaults to grind the Russian defenses down. The French eventually forced the Russians from the field, but it was a hollow victory. The Russian army was damaged but not destroyed. Its retreat was disciplined, its will to continue the struggle remained. Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting that seizure of the old capital would compel negotiation. Instead, he found a city largely abandoned, soon consumed by fire. He had marched farther than ever before, but found no political resolution at the end of the road. As the weeks passed and no peace offer came, the terrible reality of his position became clear. Winter approached. Supplies dwindled. The Russian army recovered and harassed his flanks. Suddenly, the weapon of rapid movement, so often his greatest strength, turned against him. His army was too deep, the distances too vast, the weather too cruel. The retreat from Russia became a nightmare of hunger, frost, and relentless attack. Horses died in droves, guns were abandoned in the snow, men froze in their sleep or fell behind and were lost. Napoleon still demonstrated flashes of his old operational skill in organizing rear guards and salvaging fragments of his forces, but even his genius could not conjure food from barren land or shelter from the endless cold. The grand army that had crossed the Niemen as a mighty host returned as a broken remnant. This catastrophe emboldened his enemies. A new coalition formed, determined to press the advantage. Yet even now, in the campaigns of 1,813 and 1,814 inches Germany and on French soil, Napoleon showed that his mastery of central position and rapid maneuver had not deserted him. With diminished resources and fewer seasoned troops, he conducted a series of operations that impressed even his adversaries. In 1814, within the borders of France, he moved along interior lines, striking at invading armies separately, winning sharp victories at places like Champaubert, Montmirail, and Montereau. Time and again, he demonstrated how a smaller but more agile force, guided by a unified command, could outfight larger but clumsier coalitions. However, numbers and resources had finally tipped the scale against him. The coalition powers had learned from bitter experience. They coordinated their movements more carefully, refused to be drawn into the kind of isolated engagements that suited him, and steadily tightened the noose. At Leipzig in 1813, the greatest battle Europe had yet seen, his forces were overwhelmed in a multi-day struggle against a coalition whose sheer size eroded the power of his maneuver. His eventual abdication and exile followed the invasion of France itself. For most men, such a fall would mark the end of influence. For Napoleon, it was only an interlude. In the astonishing episode known as the 100 Days, he returned from exile, landed on French soil, and marched inland as royal troops sent to arrest him joined him instead. His charisma, his legend, and the memory of past glories rekindled loyalty. In a brief span of time, he reassembled an army and prepared for one more attempt to overturn the European order. His strategic concept in this final campaign remained true to the principles that had guided him for decades. Facing a coalition in which British-led forces under Wellington and Prussian forces under Blücher were positioned in Belgium, he sought once more to exploit his central position between them. His aim was simple in outline, yet complex in execution: drive between the two armies, defeat one before the other could intervene, then turn and crush the second. The pattern echoed Italy, echoed Germany, echoed so many earlier campaigns. At Ligny, he defeated the Prussians in a hard-fought battle. At Quatre Bras, his forces fought the British Allied army to a standstill, but failed to deliver a decisive blow. The coordination and precision that had once been instinctive now showed small cracks. Orders were delayed or misinterpreted. Subordinates hesitated or acted autonomously in ways that did not always align with his intent. Though he pushed Blücher back, the Prussians were not destroyed. They retreated in a direction that allowed them to march later to Wellington's aid. Once more, the invisible elements of war, communication, and will shaped events. At Waterloo, Napoleon faced Wellington on a ridgeline near a small Belgian village, under skies heavy with rain. The field was muddy, slowing movement, especially for artillery. He delayed his main assault until the ground dried somewhat, a delay that many have debated ever since. His plan relied on a series of attacks to pin and wear down the British Allied line, followed by a decisive blow that would break it. Throughout the day, French columns advanced into storms of musketry and canister. Cavalry charged across sodden fields, at times with magnificent courage but limited coordination. The British Allied infantry, entrenched in strong positions and supported by their own artillery, held grimly. All the while, a question hung over the field. Where were the Prussians, and when would they arrive? Napoleon had dispatched forces to delay them, but the Prussians, driven by a determination shaped in previous defeats, pressed on. Late in the day, their columns appeared on the French flank and rear, introducing a new element into the already desperate struggle. Napoleon, who had so often used central position to defeat divided enemies, now found himself the target of converging armies. He responded as he always had, committing reserves, including the Imperial Guard, to attempt to restore the balance. When the Guard's attack failed and the line began to crumble, the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded him for so long shattered. The retreat became a rout. His final attempt to reshape Europe by arms had ended in defeat. Exiled far from the continent he had once dominated, on the lonely island of St. Helena, Napoleon spent his last years dictating his memories, shaping his own legend for posterity. He presented himself as a lawgiver, a modernizer, a misunderstood genius defeated not by his own errors but by the vastness of the forces arrayed against him. He highlighted his reforms, his codes, his contributions to administrative rationality, insisting that these would outlast the ephemeral verdicts of kings and battles. Time proved him right in ways he could not fully foresee. His military methods, his campaigns, and his strategic concepts became foundational subjects for study in military academies around the world. Officers pored over maps of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and Waterloo, analyzing his operational designs, his use of reserves, his choices of when and where to accept battle, the principle of concentration of force at decisive points, the exploitation of interior lines, the modular core structure, the fusion of political and military objectives, all became enduring topics of study. Beyond the barracks and lecture halls, his legal and administrative reforms endured as well. The civil code he championed influenced laws in Europe and beyond, embedding ideas of legal equality and standardized procedure that outlived his empire. Many of the states that had resisted him later adopted his administrative practices, recognizing their efficiency even as they rejected his imperial authority. Infrastructure projects begun under his rule remained. Roads and bridges that bore witness to the practical side of his governance. Culturally, he became a symbol of towering ambition. Artists depicted him in many guises: the romantic hero on a rearing horse, the stern lawgiver, the solitary exile gazing over the sea. Writers and thinkers grappled with his meaning. Was he a monster of ego or a force of necessary transformation? Did he betray the ideals of the revolution by grasping at empire, or did he carry those ideals into the realm of concrete institutions? The debate over his legacy mirrored the complexity of his life. For students of war, however, Napoleon Bonaparte stands above all as a reminder of what a single mind endowed with exceptional clarity, imagination, and will can do when given command of vast resources. He turned artillery from a supporting arm into a central instrument of decision, demonstrating the power of concentrated fire. He organized armies not as inflexible masses, but as agile systems of semi-independent corps capable of swift convergence. He grasped the importance of speed and surprise, of communication and deception, of morale and myth. In his hands, war became a theater in which movement and timing mattered as much as brute numbers. Yet his story also warns that even the greatest strategist cannot escape the fundamental limits of geography, climate, and human endurance. His genius allowed him to win battles that seemed impossible, to dominate continents for a time, but it could not undo the consequences of overreach in Russia, the grinding resistance in Spain, or the growing resolve of his enemies. The very scale of his ambition ensured that resistance would, eventually, match and surpass it. Still, when we trace the lines of modern strategy, we return again and again to his campaigns. The doctrine of decisive battle, the concept of operational art, the notion that political objectives must guide military plans, the emphasis on fully integrated forces combining different arms under unified command, these are pillars of contemporary military thought that bear his mark. He transformed war from the limited contests of rival courts into an immense people-mobilizing enterprise that foreshadowed the wars of later centuries. The guns that opened the way for his rise have long been silent. The fields where his armies marched are now peaceful landscapes, their hills and rivers carrying only the echoes of his past. Yet in the lecture halls where young officers learn their craft, in the books and studies where historians analyze causes and consequences, and in the legal codes and institutions that shape daily life in many countries, his presence still lingers. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as one of the greatest commanders in history, not because he was flawless, but because he changed the very grammar of warfare and governance. He fused intellect and audacity, calculation and instinct, science and will. From obscure beginnings on a rugged island, he rose to command empires and to wage campaigns whose movements are still traced and taught. He showed what could be achieved when strategy reaches beyond the map to seize time itself, compressing distances and decisions into bursts of concentrated action. His victories were many. His defeats were catastrophic. His reign was brief compared to the centuries he has influenced. But as long as human beings study power, ambition, and the art of war, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of artillery and movement, the ruler who turned Europe into his chessboard and then lost it, will stand as an epic of genius and consequence, a tale of how one man changed warfare forever and carved his name into the memory of the world.